Here's some people and what they know about the Native Americans during the westward expansion.
So what can I do? I don't know what can I do.
They lost a lot of land and property and living quarters and whatever because they had to move on to reservations, which were hard living for them, more restrictive than what they lived.
Diseases like smallpox.
What?
My hair's messy, I can't.
They put them in reservations and killed the rest off.
It totally destroyed the Native American culture, and we should give it back because we stole it from the Native Americans. So it had a huge impact, and it was wrong.
Unicorn.
Yeah, well, if I'm not mistaken, Western expansion actually started limiting the land that the Native Americans had. It started taking away some of their land resources, I believe. Am I correct? So I mean, how it affected their life, I would say that it started forcing them to, I don't know, move other places and find other locations to live. So, I mean,
in every way possible.
The buffalo ended up getting hunted down by the railroads coming through and Westerners coming through. Different diseases popped through because they weren't used to the same things Europeans were. And it moved them off of, lands that they had had for a long time that we ended up taking.
He doesn't know.
Well, it basically pushed them off their land and made it so white settlers could move on to it.
Okay, the settlers pushed the Indians out of their land, and then it made the buffaloes diminish in population.
The Native Americans had a tribal way of life, and when the Europeans came over, they proposed a new way of living that they had not thought of before. Not a bad way of living, but a different way of living. They changed their way of life because they went from a tribal society to an agricultural society.
Reject their land.
Negatively, the Native Americans were driven from their lands, they were oppressed, they were infected, and they were fought against.
I have no idea.
Hi, I'm Jethro.
I'm Fred Flintstone. How did the Westward impact the Native Americans' way of life?
More than 12 million died, buffalo were killed, and Native Americans were forced into reservations.
Treaties/compromises. There were several Indian removal acts, but one that was in 1830 meant to clear 100,000 remaining Native Americans from lands east of the Mississippi River. The act required tribes to move to Indian territory west of the Mississippi River. The act also provided money and assistance to tribes that moved willingly. There were about 90,000 treaties signed. The Homestead Act was a group of laws that gave people ownership of land at little to no cost. This act was passed on May 20th, 1862. They could get 160 acres of land. After 5 years, the original filer was entitled to the land. The land that the head of the family got was publicly surveyed land. There were 605 million acres of land available, and it was $1.25 per acre after 6 months of residence. The treaties/compromises are important because the government broke the treaties, which is like breaking a promise. This shows what the government did to get rid of the Native Americans. Even if the Native Americans left willingly, they were still put in reservations. The United States didn't remain loyal to the Native Americans.
War/conflicts. One of the battles between the Indians and Americans was the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890. The battle was a large-scale attempt by the Indians to resist American settlement in the Great Plains region. Federal soldiers opened fire on the Indians, killing more than 200 of them. Another big battle was the Battle of Little Bighorn. This area memorializes the U.S. Army, cavalry, and the Sioux and Cheyenne in one of the Indians' last armed efforts to preserve their way of life. Sitting Bull attacked General George Custer's troops, killing over 200 men. The Battle of Little Bighorn was a result of the Sioux being moved to reservation just to have miners searching for gold on their reservation. The battle put a great amount of impact during this time because it shows how Native Americans resisted American authority and Americans who were moving westward, and how Native Americans died. In other words, Native Americans were trying to secure their land, but the Americans beat them. Culture/identity. The Cherokees, Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Seminoles, whom white referred to as the 5 civilized tribes, occupied sizable tracts of land in Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida. All these tribes had their own culture, identity, and ways of practicing religion. Portions of these tribes had accepted the teachings of white ministries and accepted Christianity, white inventions, and even the concept of slavery. Buffalo were part of the Indian culture, but Americans killed them, which was also killing the Indian culture. This shows how Native Americans have been forced to change culturally and to the mindset of white Americans with the same beliefs/values as them. Reservations and Sovereignty. A reservation is a piece of land set aside for the use of an Indian tribe. Native Americans were forced to give up their land for space in homestead and railroads. That ended them in reservations. This is important because it shows how ambitious the government was. The Native Americans were either killed or put in reservations. Sovereignty is like a monarchy, which is ran by a king or a queen. In this case, the reservation was ran by the chief of the tribe. Governing your own land is important because you get to decide what's good for land. You also get to make the choices in how things run. Genocide. The Americans took the Native Americans' foods such as flora and fauna. Europeans moving to the U.S. and traveling westward came along with smallpox. Since the Native Americans had never been exposed to that, several died. Native Americans depended hugely on the buffalo. As a result, Americans killed them because the buffalo were in their way for food, clothing, and for sport, which caused food shortages for the Indians. The population of buffalo went from 30 million in 1800 to less than 100,000 in 1889. This is important because several Native Americans lost their innocent lives because of the Americans taking their resources and killing them. Roughly 12 million Native Americans. Population. By the beginning of the 19th century, the Indian population at large had dwindled, and the only Indians remaining inside the borders of the United States lived in tight communities, very much separated from white society. Despite the efforts of some to integrate them into white American life. This is important because the Indian population was very big before the Americans traveled westward, and all of a sudden the population decreased dramatically.
A quick summary of what happened to the Native Americans during the westward expansion. Native Americans were lied to, stolen from, and killed. Americans broke their promises and agreements with the Native Americans. Native Americans had a lot of land stolen from them because the Americans wanted to expand and have more options. Native Americans were killed because they decided to fight back the government.